Hello, and welcome to another edition of Brussels Sprouts. I'm Andrea Kendall-Taylor.
And I'm Jim Townsend.
And we're so glad you can join us. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney made headlines at this year's World Economic Forum in Davos with his speech in which he declared that the international system is in the midst of a rupture, not a transition, and that middle powers must diversify their relationships and reduce their dependence on great powers such as the United States. Carney called for middle powers to diversify their partnerships and to cooperate among themselves to hedge against rising uncertainty and great powers' weaponization of interdependence. Put clearly, Carney asserted that the middle powers must act together because, quote, if we're not at the table, we're on the menu. Carney's speech was praised far and wide, with many crediting him with putting his finger on and calling out what many have been feeling, especially in the last year under the Trump administration. What remains to be seen, though, is whether middle powers such as Canada and its transatlantic partners will truly be able to form the new partnerships needed to reduce their dependence on the United States and navigate changing geopolitical realities. To help us find the answer to these questions and more, we're excited to welcome Barry Posen and Ivo Dadler to Brussels Sprouts.
Great to be here.
Quick introductions. Barry Posen is a professor of international relations at MIT and former director of the MIT Security Studies program. And Ivo is senior fellow at Harvard's Belfer Center. He was previously the president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and the U.S. ambassador to NATO from 2009 to 2013. Barry, let me start with you and ask why you think the Carney speech hit such a nerve. It went totally viral, received widespread attention. Was it just the timing against the backdrop of Greenland, or was there something more?
I think Carney's speech was it was the right speech, and it was a very smart speech, very honest speech. And of course, where he gave it, Davos is a great venue. And with President Trump there at Davos, there was an element of gladiatorial drama that was introduced to the situation. So, I think sort of everything broke right for that speech. I think substantively, his diagnosis of the problem is both accurate and fair, right? He was honest about what the liberal world order was. There was always an element of hypocrisy. That's not a surprise to anyone. People could live with a considerable element of hypocrisy so long as, in general, everyone was gaining from the system and expected, rough compliance with norms most of the time. And the fact is that President Trump has broken that crockery, and there's a continuity between his crockery breaking with alliances in his second term and his first, with one exception. It's much more intense in the second term than it is in the first. So, in every respect, countries that have relied on us either as a an investment partner, or more pointedly as a security partner, have to, it is neither wise nor predicted in social science that they would do very little. Right now, it's a separate question of how much they can do. Right, and there are many issues that govern what they can do, but the prompt is there, and the prompt is reasonable. And as I think any world leader that's been involved with us who sort of feels like they can, sort of do a little dance for 3 years and then hope that, for the second coming of Joe Biden is basically, casting their fate to the wind.
Yeah, we'll come back to whether or not they can do it. But Ivo, kind of same question to you. What was it about this speech that sent all of our Twitter or our X feeds blowing up?
Timing means everything. It was the right audience, as Barry said. It was the right moment. Greenland sort of crystallized that the president of the United States wasn't really taking the more traditional view about how nations ought to behave against and with each other, the traditional World War II view, not the traditional historical view. He was actually expressing the traditional historical view of great powers do what they want, and small powers shall do what they have to badly paraphrase or quote
Yeah, and to not be
Thucydides.
on the menu, right?
Yeah, well, that's another one. I mean, the interesting thing I have about Carney is because Carney's been saying this for over a year. Even the idea of rupture is something he used during the campaign. Friedrich Merz gave a speech both to the CSU party conference in December and then in his New Year's speech, in which he said that the Pax Americana, the era of the Pax Americana, is over. So you never know why at one point something is crystallizing. I think the larger point is that, with few exceptions, and we should talk about that, but in few exceptions, America's allies have come to realize that the way they have dealt, that the traditional way of dealing with the United States, that has defined how they saw the world and how they would deal with the world since really 1945, or in some ways even 1949, depending on which ally you're talking about, that's gone. And you know, I've often described uh, 2025 as our allies going through the 5 stages of grief. Everybody knew that the order that had defined America's engagement in the world and the global order that came with it had died on January 20, 2025, when Donald Trump was inaugurated. It just took a very long time to move from denial through anger, through mediation to depression, and ultimately to acceptance. And the fundamental question is not the diagnosis, which I think is correct. The fundamental question is not that the solution, which is that middle powers allies have actual real strength, they have real agency if they work together. The fundamental question is, will they? And I think that's it's a very timely conversation, because while I think there is now, again, with one or two exceptions, a general acceptance that the world in which these countries live will no longer be driven or determined by subservience or dependence on the United States, there's still the real question: so how are you going to act, and what are you going to do about it from going forward?
So you both have really touched on this point of that we're not going back. And I think that's certainly the general consensus. But how would you lay out, like, what is it? So on one hand, the argument that for the fact that the allies need to do more is that just the geopolitical challenges have accumulated. We face a growing coalescence between Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. Just that the challenges facing the United States are so extent that we just need to have a Europe that does more. That's kind of one set of arguments. But what you both are touching on, I think, is more of a kind of domestic kind of policy, that there isn't support in the United States anymore moving forward to have that same traditional relationship. Is that what you're both getting at? And how do you spell that out for allies to make the point that, Donald Trump being voted to office a second time demonstrates that there is something that has fundamentally changed about the United States such that the relationship can't be the same?
It's tempting to sort of say that this is simply the election of Donald Trump and Donald Trump's strange ideas and strange ways of doing business, but it's also the fact that he could be elected, that a person with such different views could be elected. And what should that suggest to allies about continuity in American policy? In other words, if the American people are inclined, even at the margin, 51% of voters, to vote for a person who has demonstrated their really lack of interest in many American international relationships, that's a statement. It's evidence, right? A second bit of evidence is the relative lack of pushback from the senior figures in the Republican Party. In other words, that if you're looking hard at it, I think you have to, if you're a European or Japanese or wherever, you have to conclude that that something's changed within the party elites, and it's a lot of that's just demographic, right? In other words, the older ones either are driven out or they retire, Good thing some do retire. I wish more retired on both parties. But they're driven out or they retire, and those that are left who sort of still have these ideas about the alliance, and they will occasionally mouth them and verbalize them and push back. Nevertheless, they're not pushing on the president very hard. And then the third is and here I'll use the president's language, even though I don't buy everything that it entails, is that the you know, the national security organs historically in the United States, even when the political jobs are repopulated by each new president, right? There's a continuity in that elite, in that establishment, right? There is, dare I call it, the deep state. It's not really the right term, but there was a kind of consensus in the American foreign policy establishment, one that I basically argued against for much of my life. and, we have been on the opposite sides of this discussion, right? But that in the first administration, the Trump staffed his national security apparatus with like standard people, right, who could put brakes on him, right? But that's not who has been staffing his national security positions now. And secondly, those who have staffed those positions are quite cooperative with the president's vision or visions, whatever it is on any given day, right? So if you're trying to ask a question about future stability of U.S. commitment, even if you thought things would be better in some future Democratic Party, which is a whole other issue, right? You still have to think that if the United States remains a democracy, liberal Democrats, world order liberal Democrats, I should say, will not necessarily always be in charge. And the pendulum swings. If you get caught in the pendulum swing, right, you could be in really bad shape. So if you value your security and your prosperity, right, and you've been tightly involved with the United States, at an absolute minimum, you have to do some of the things that Carney was talking about. So basically, resilience, alternatives, different networks for different problems, different coalitions for different problems, investment internally in some things. Yes, you're going to give up some efficiency. You might, in an economic sense, in the pure free trade sense. But what you're buying instead is flexibility and resilience against sort of whatever is good, nature is going to bring you, and you to be able to be willing to make these investments, you have to at least assimilate the idea that there's been some kind of fundamental change in American politics, even if it's not time yet to sort of put the last nail in the coffin of transatlanticism or anything else. Even if it's not time to do that, it is time to sort of tell yourself this is not the kind of reliable partner over time around which we've wrapped our entire economic and security lives.
I mean, so I agree with a lot of that. Certainly, the last point. I think the last point, putting yourself in the shoe of an ally, it would be strategic malpractice on the part of any ally to believe that the reliability and trustworthiness of the United States will return once this particular president has left the seat. That would be strategic malpractice, and indeed anyone who believes that ought to have their head examined. That said, uh, I don't think that we are in a midst of a massive domestic fundamental reassessment of how the United States should behave. I used to be part of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, which has done the most polling on American attitudes towards the role in international politics. And the latest poll, on which I luckily had absolutely nothing to do with, that came out just last month, again showed that there is overwhelming U.S. support for alliances for NATO, for troops in foreign countries, the kind of foreign policy the United States has practiced for the last 80 years. So I do think that there remains a foundational essence that can be exploited by the right kinds of leadership to restore America's positive engagement in the world by working together with allies. But I do think something fundamental has changed within the overall party politics. And if you see the differences between Democrats and Republicans, they have continued to grow. Barry is absolutely right that even those in the Republican establishment who remain deeply connected to NATO and understand its importance have not spoken up to the president. The reason is because the president runs the Democratic Party like any Leninist does, as a democratic centralist organization, in which the word from the top gets mouthed to the very bottom. And if you talk to the MAGA sphere or read it, it's the same old everywhere. And people, even who don't believe it, will repeat it. You will see Lindsey Graham say things that we know Lindsey Graham doesn't believe. Says more about Lindsey Graham and the power that Trump has than it says about anything else. So the second thing that I think is important, and Barry mentioned this too, is the demographic issue. I point out to European friends, of whom I have many, that if they only would have read or listened to or go and reread Bob Gates's June 2011 speech, which I was present at, but Jim may have been present at too, but I was at the time the U.S. ambassador and had a hand in, which was a warning that the ability of the United States to carry the burden at the level that it had been carrying was going to disappear because the generation that understood this in this bones was disappearing from the scene. And so you have to make it. You have to make the argument on a cost benefit analysis. And frankly, the Europeans didn't listen. And Barry rightly has been hitting the Europeans over the head for a very long time. That they needed to do more. I think part of what we are seeing is the result of their own decision, starting in 2000, to unilaterally disarm. And that's what the Europeans are doing. They unilaterally disarmed for 15 years. They then spent 5 years sort of navel gazing and trying to figure out how they could do a little bit more. And only really in the last year or two have started to think, now we need to invest in our defense and be really capable. The problem is it's going to take a long time, right, for Europe to undo the damage that its unilateral disarmament over the last 25 years or first 15 years of this century to overcome that. But hopefully they will. I guess that's what we'll talk about next.
Yeah, I mean, let's jump into it. I mean, because that is, both of you have already made this point, is like the diagnosis is correct. And again, I mean, Ivo, excellent point. It was, I've been, that this isn't, Carney's not the first to say it. I was thinking a lot about the recent Merz speeches. I mean, this is something that people had been widely saying, but whatever, the timing of the Carney speech is what got everyone exercised. So the diagnosis, I think, is widely accepted across large parts of the globe, certainly across most of Europe. The question that both of you have already raised is, can they do it? And I don't know, dig into it. Let's get into that. I mean, Barry, I know you've written quite a lot about the fact that yes, Europe can in fact defend itself. But looking at where we are today, and if we are looking at a kind of rapid transition away from the United States, are the European allies up to it?
Well, there's two elements of this. There's a kind of a material, technological resource element to it, and then there's a political will aspect to it. The Europeans have lots of capability. Ivo is right about the kind of hollowing out of European militaries over the last 20 years. But there is infrastructure, there are units, there is technology, there are weapon systems. I mean, there is quite a lot of defense spending, right? There's quite a lot of military expertise. There are officer corps that are very skilled, right? So it's they have to do two things. In the first instance, they have to fill up the hollow militaries that they have with weapons, extra weapons, munition stocks, parts, this, that, and the other. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is they have to think about whether they need to do more and what would that more be, right? So they have to put themselves in a position short term that if things go very bad, very fast, that the worst doesn't happen, complete catastrophe. And then they can begin trying to say, okay, if we think we can stave off the worst, what can we do to put ourselves in a kind of a much stronger, much more comfortable position? Right? So I think the money resources are there. I think the military production resources are there. But they do have a problem is with people, and it's not so much the core officer corps. It's individuals to fill the ranks. Right? The Germans have to grow their force a bit. The Brits have to grow their force a bit. The French have to grow their forces because we've seen in real war people get burned up. That's even if you send a fully staffed unit in, you're going to take casualties, and you have to be able. This is all grim stuff, right? And people don't want to think about it, and that's that's understandable. But it's they have to get beyond that. There's the aligned issue, which is if you think you're going to fight without much American help, then you have to discourage the other guy from making nuclear threats, which means one of the two nuclear powers in Europe, at least one, and preferably both, has to do or say something in its policy that says to the Russians, we would never be first, but if you're first, then something bad is going to happen. That's a pretty big commitment to make. The French have alluded to it sometimes, the British have alluded to it sometimes, but you have to make it. You have to figure out a way that you're going to make it meaningful, and you have to start now to make it meaningful so that the meaning is there in the crisis. And here, I'm not talking about buying America's nuclear forces, this thing that the SecGen Root was talking about, which is, to me, idiocy, right? The British and French nuclear forces probably need to be plussed up somewhat, but they don't have to ape the look of American forces. Okay, so this is this is stuff that you could kind of see they could do. I mean, remember, in World War II, if you wanted to mobilize an industrial economy for war, it took 30 months. That's all it took, right? If you really were serious, threw a lot of resources at it, controlled your economy, and you thought the wolf was at the door, you could produce quite a lot of capability in Europe in 30 months. I mean, it would be the Russians, I think, who would be scared, frankly, right? So that's so the more interesting question, I think, for certainly for international relations theorists, but they don't matter very much in this situation. But for people trying to forecast the policy future or trying to engineer a policy future, is the problem of cooperation among states, right? And the situation is kind of strange, right? And because from the one point of view, fear powerfully motivates states to build up their own capability and to coalesce with others if they have to. And it can provide a glue that will make up for a lot of rivalry, right? And that's true, I think, especially in the military sphere. But the question is, when and how does the mentality of enough European statesmen shift to a belief that the wolf really is at the door? Then there's the second element, which is a little more interesting and about which I feel like I have a lot less expertise, which is a big part of Carney's speech was about economic things, about trade and prosperity and dependence on resources and currencies and all this other kind of good stuff that is also in the wind right now. Right now, it'd be easy enough for me to take an IR theory built on security and say, well, if you balance military-wise, you'll balance economically. But that's probably not a completely comfortable transposition to make. So here, what I'm going to do is take refuge in the argument of my in an international relations theory sense, my liberal friends, and point out that those countries that feel like they're being cut adrift by the United States have a big menu of functioning liberal international institutions to which they can, appeal or in which they can cooperate. And the European Union is the biggest one. And I'll just say in closing, because Ivo's been very patient with my long-windedness here, I'll just say in closing, we have one thing we should ask ourselves, right? Is why does Donald Trump hate the European Union? And he hates the European Union because it's an economic power concentration rival. And he would like to break it up and turn it into a bunch of little followers, right? And if they don't know that in Europe, then I'm not going to be able to explain it to them.
Ivo, reactions? Can they and thoughts? Can they do it?
So, I, I mean, the answer is, of course, they can. They have the capacity. I think. I mean, Barry laid out the military side. The question of how long it will take it is out there, but there's no reason to believe that a community of 450 million people with a GDP that is rivaling that of China cannot build a military to hold off a peanut country like Russia when it comes to political and economic power. Militarily, yes, there are issues like the nuclear dimension and everything else, but we have a long history of how to deal with extended deterrence, which, by the way, is just easier when you are extending the deterrent on your own continent than you do it over a big ocean. So let me. I think the real question is the other one of the political will, and betting on Europe doing the right thing at the right time doesn't make you rich. Betting on Europe to do the right thing after a long time does make you quite rich. So I remain relatively optimistic that Europe will, in the end, maintain the political will necessary to take the steps that they need to take. Why do I say that? Well, the most important player in Europe has already made that decision. The German government deciding to break with the debt brake, make available €1 trillion for 4 years to enable it to build up the economic infrastructure and military power within the next 4 years. Germany will be spending as a percentage of GDP more than the United States on defense in 2029, which is, when you think about it, pretty remarkable. Germany will soon become the third largest military power in the world. That's the commitment they have made. That is very significant. And there is a political consensus behind this within the country. Yes, I think Barry's right to point out in terms of personnel issues and those kinds of questions. They're real, but the Russians are helping. The Russians are every day doing things that make it easier to sell the threat as a means for mobilization. A second piece of evidence is, and here I betray my old roots. If I look at the Dutch cabinet formation that has just concluded of a minority cabinet, but nevertheless a cabinet that is going to move forward, they, as part of the coalition agreement, have agreed to a freedom tax. They're going to tax the Dutch people to pay for 3.5% of defense spending. And wish the United States had done that when we went to war against Afghanistan and Iraq, which one would have made it less likely we would have been as stupid as we did for those wars, but we also would be in a far better fiscal position had we actually paid for the wars that we conducted in the last 25 years. The Dutch are about to do that. We know the Nordics have already incalculated this. We know most of Eastern Europe has. So there's going to be a very significant amount of money made available. By the way, so is Canada, making billions and billions of dollars of investment in defense and infrastructure spending. So I do think there is the potential of the political will. And every time that Donald Trump talks about taking over Greenland, or puts on more tariffs, or raises other questions about the nature of the relationship, the political will strengthen. But, and here's the but there are too many people in Europe, not naming names because that doesn't matter, but there are too many people in Europe who think that this is temporary, that the United States will come back, that what we are doing is to try to prove to the United States that we're good guys, as opposed to proving to ourselves that we need to do this. And that is a recipe for disaster because it's not real. You cannot say to your public, we are going to invest a significant portion of our national income in defense, but we're only doing that in order to convince the United States that the United States needs to defend us. That's just not a viable strategy. And so unless and until the Europeans take on the idea that the Europeanization of their security is fundamental to their security, rather than we are doing more burden sharing to help the United States. We're not going to be getting into, and that is where I think the debate will go to. I worry about less about merits. I worry about the UK in particular, which has sold its entire security establishment to the United States, both its intelligence and its military. It doesn't have an independent nuclear deterrent. It has a nuclear deterrent that is run, owned, and operated by the United States. Oh yeah, there's some British boats that are part of that, and that is a problem, and that's a real problem. And I think most of the East Europeans, frankly, don't want to think about the day that they have to rely on the French and the Germans and the Brits. Finally, I am Dutch enough to worry about the European consequences of having a Germany of unequal military and political power. I'm worried not because I think Germany will turn bad. I'm worried because the Germans are worried about it, and I think the German question, which was resolved at the end of the Cold War, through the unification of Germany in NATO, the German question will reappear. I already see it. You hear rumblings of it. You see it in the Franco-German relationship. Politics doesn't stop just because Donald Trump gets elected. In fact, politics returns. History doesn't stop because Donald Trump decides to end the Pax Americana. In fact, history returns. And in some ways, and Bob Kagan is the one who's made this argument over and over and over again, we have taken a holiday from history for 75 years. We're back into a great power competition kind of way, a world that Barry is far more comfortable with than I am. But good for Barry to have studied it for so many years in so many ways. But Europeans have forgotten that world, and it's important that we remember, how bad that world was and what new lessons we can learn. The EU may well be, final point, a way out of that, but this is complicated stuff, politically and militarily and in other ways, even if materially it actually isn't that complicated.
Yeah, Barry, react to that a little bit. I mean, you made this point about, having an external enemy or the fear can be a strong enough adhesive to overcome some of these rivalries. So how do you react to what Ivo just said? Like, how concerned are you that if the United States really is playing a much less significant role, that there's this greater push for more autonomy, that some of these old rivalries reemerge and that fragmentation actually is a meaningful barrier to their ability to coordinate in the way that would be required?
Well, I mean, multipolar systems are kind of interesting for that reason, right? Who's going to align with whom is not necessarily forecastable in advance. I would say that the basic story is historically is that the the country with the country that's close, that seems ferocious, and that has a lot of combat power and is waving it around is the one that tends to inject energy into the system that cause others to coalesce, right? And for reasons we've discussed, in part reasons of history, despite Ivo's observation that in economic and material terms, Russia is not superior to European states as an assemblage. Russia is larger than any single European state, even the largest one, and has a nuclear force that's comparable to the American nuclear force, and a huge amount of combat experience, and clearly a willingness to take casualties, right? So, they're the scary element here. Now, just because there's a scary element of the kind we've discussed about, and there are pressures for those in the penumbra to coalesce, doesn't mean that the process of coalescence is not fraught, right? The French and the British found themselves fighting on the same side in the first half of the 20th century, right? But it wasn't so long before that they weren't necessarily on the same side, and even that coalition, which was driven by really quite impressive German power, both in First World War and Second World War, it's still, even in the war, you find yourself having these disagreements, some large and some small, right? Now, the problem in terms of what maybe game theorists would tell us or oligopoly theorists would tell us, is that you need some leadership to make these coalitions come together, right? And the problem that Eva was talking about in Europe is the historical overhang for shadowing who it is who has the capability to be the leader versus who has let who down in the past, or worse, conquered everybody and despoiled them and killed them, right? So the fact of the matter is that the two poles or lodestars of European security cooperation are France and Germany. They have a terrible experience, one with the other, right? But at the same time, they work very hard to try and get by that. And each has something that the other needs in this situation. France has the nuclear capabilities, and Germany has the economy, right? But, you know, you know, that alone is not enough, because they need the help of lots of other European states, and other European states have to swallow hard and say, I'm going to follow these two. Like the French have betrayed me in the past, the Germans have despoiled me in the past. I'm going to follow these two. And what makes you follow these two historically across the long sweep of history is the wolf that's at the door is even worse, right? So you could argue that it's showtime for IR theory, although that's not of interest to people who have to live with this, right? In other words, are we going to see, balancing? Are we going to see it, what I think the theorists of cooperation call K group cooperation, where two or three large leaders can can cooperate to solve some kinds of problems, right? Or are we going to see, the typical problems, logic of collective action? I don't trust you, you don't trust me. You'll wait too long, the wolf will be at the door, he'll kick the door in, and then suddenly realize, oh, there are things I should have done 10 years ago, right? Evo's a better student of Europe than I am by far, right? It's funny because the mood music he has shared with us, it actually makes me feel better, because his interpretation of the Europeans is it feels to me like they're farther along than I would have guessed, right? Than I would have, on the basis of my read, guessed. Now, there's a lot of good verbiage, there's some good action, but the really hard decisions, even the beginnings of them, have not happened yet. And those whispering voices from those who say, this could pass. We don't really have to follow the Germans. We may be able to just stick with the Americans. We don't have to suffer the indignities of taking orders from the Germans and the French. We can suffer the indignities of taking orders from the Americans, who are far away and are easy to fool, right? We'd prefer that one, right? Well, will they take counsel of their hopes and dreams, or will they take counsel of their fears? And Evo's dead right that Vladimir Putin helps them helps the forces of coalescence every day.
Curious to get both of your reactions. I mean, one thing that we have talked about on this podcast before, though, is this movement more towards coalitions of the willing, where we're not finding the kind of entire kind of unified responses on NATO as a whole, but moving more into these, in Ukraine, we've got the coalition of the willing, we've got the JEF. There seems to be more, the states closest to Russia, obviously, moving in a much faster direction than some of the Southern Europeans. Is that an acceptable outcome to this as well, or do we need the kind of full unity that we've had for the past, or as close to the full unity as we've seen for the past 70 or so years?
I think that's an important question, and it opens up a whole new can of worms. So I would distinguish between the political side of a coalition of the willing and the operational one. And I think the political side, having mini lateralisms and cooperation, and having the Nordic Baltic 8 and all of those, makes total sense. It's how large organizations function. Operationally, it doesn't work. And importantly, in the following sense, the coalition of the willing for Ukraine is indeed founded on the idea that this is a NATO operation, whether de facto or de jure. It doesn't operate. It can't work without the imprimatur of a NATO structure, including U.S. participation in the ISR, and ultimately in the backstop. And so I have long argued and believe it's incredibly important that the operational structure for European defense needs to be NATO. Now, it needs to be a fundamentally different NATO than the one the United States over the last 75 years led, because the United States is not going to lead anymore. And therefore it needs a changes in command structure. It needs changes in war planning, which really, as Jim knows better than anybody else, gets done by UCOM and not by NATO. And so the de-Americanization and Europeanization of NATO is absolutely necessary in order to succeed operationally and through that in the deterrent sense, vis-a-vis um, Russia and everyone else. And that means there are really fundamentally two requirements. Europeans need to stop talking about non-NATO European defense cooperation, European armies and all that sort of stuff. Yeah, have a European army, but it's got to be in NATO. Otherwise, it won't do anything. So the whole EU, we need our, all that sort of nonsense needs to be gone. And the United States needs to actively, something it has never done, in fact, actively opposed, actively encourage Europe to take greater responsibility. I mean, we talk about burden sharing because we want Europeans to pay for our burden. But if you want to do burden shifting, which is what the Trump administration wants, and which is why it's going to be easier now than it ever was before, then it means shifting responsibility and capabilities from the United States to Europe, something the US has never wanted to do, but this administration does. So the Europeans need to take that on. So it's two things. There is now, for the first time, the possibility of totally Europeanizing NATO. And that means down the road, yes, you will not have an American SAC here. Who cares? That's not the point. Good luck trying to find out who it would be, but that's a different issue. But that's not what it is. It's the operational structure that NATO provides, the force planning, all of the things that Jim has cut his teeth on more than anybody else. That's critical, but it needs to become European and not American. Canadian European, not American.
If I could jump in, Andrea, thank you for giving me the opening. But I just want to foot stomp what Eva was saying. I agree with that. And for Dr. Posen, I the same thing. A lot of things that you raised. I think making sure that as these European nations begin to put together whatever they're going to call themselves in terms of trying to fill the gaps left by the United States and be more involved, more engaged, and shouldering more of the defense of Europe. My great fear has been that that they might turn to the EU or even something or a new institution of some type outside of NATO and the EU to do their coordinating and this type of thing. That'd be a horrible approach because there'd be a lot of wheel spinning. There won't be a lot of agreement. We do have a ticking clock here in terms of the Russians, so there's no time to be lost. There's no margin. So just to foot stomp what Eva was saying, NATO has the structures within it to help them organize themselves in terms of who does what. NATO mentioned, Evo mentioned NATO defense planning, etc. But it is my fear that once the wheel spinning stops and the European nations begin to spend the money to plus up their defense structures, they're all going to buy tanks. Or all of them will buy drones, and we're going to end up with a pickup game of everybody being, point guards instead of a full team. And so it's NATO, it's getting this done within NATO that's critical. And I want to throw to you all, how can we do that? I mean, I can see the European nations saying, Jim, no. We're done with NATO. You can keep NATO if you want, and they can keep the headquarters there, and they can have ministerials and stuff. But we're going to be meeting over in Oslo, and we're going to put it together. And I just think that is not the way. I think they've got to use the existing institutions and the organization there to get themselves ready to go. And so, how can we make that happen?
I mean, I think just to take a quick stab on it, I think it's incumbent on the leadership in NATO,
Yep.
which is European, to actually make that argument.
Yep.
And I think the Secretary General has spent a lot of very valuable time trying to maintain a cordial relationship with the United States, which, by the way, still is a member of NATO and is part of his job. Uh, but I think the time has come for him to pivot and to become the voice
Right.
within the organization to talk about the Europeanization of NATO. He had an incredibly successful summit in June. He kept a president who, by all accounts, was ready to walk away from NATO in NATO, and in fact happy in a pretty masterful way. But I think the next summit in Ankara should be a summit in which NATO as a whole agrees on a roadmap for the devolution of responsibility from the United States to Europe within the NATO structure.
Yeah, I agree.
And I don't know, and unless Europe leads that effort, the United States will make it a fait accompli. I mean, everything we're hearing about the timing of changes in U.S. force structure, they're faster than any timeline the Europeans are working under. And more importantly, it's already happening.
Right.
Part of the fleet is now in the Caribbean. Much of the high altitude ISR in the north is now in the Caribbean. A lot of the air defense systems have moved to the Gulf. They're not coming back. They're not there temporarily. And we're one crisis away in Asia for much of the force structure that is now in Europe, particularly that part of the force structure that is critical for the European defense, ISR in particular, being moved rapidly out. Nobody's going to have a NACA meeting about it. They're just going to do it.
Right.
And so that's the requirement. And people need to understand that we don't live in the world that we used to live in which the United States would come to the NAC and say, there's this problem called Afghanistan, and we really would like to use AWACS over there. And so, can we have an agreement? And then NATO would spend 4 months going through its CONOPS and all that jazz before it happened. They would just take the damn AWACS.
Yeah. Yeah.
Even
not gonna
even
be-
even if they're NATO owned, they would take them.
There won't be any non-papers that the U.S. is going to put on the table
Yeah,
saying
no,
you're
no,
passing
exactly.
around to the allies.
No silent procedure. I can
Yeah,
guarantee you that.
Maybe as a final line of discussion to hear from both you, Barry and Ivo, is this all good for the United States? I mean, thinking about from a U.S. national security, U.S. interest perspective, we're talking about no American SOCUR. We're talking about a Europe that seriously reduced its dependence on the United States. We've, the devolution of responsibility to Europe. Europe's dependence on the United States up until this point was by design. It was something that the was built into the system. And so now that we're having this conversation from a U.S. perspective, is this in U.S. national security and U.S. interests more broadly to be moving in this direction, and to the degree that we're talking about?
Well, personally, I think it absolutely is, and I've been arguing it for years.
That's what we call a
yeah.
softball, Barry.
But I think it's. I mean, there's two questions about one is sort of the direction, and the other is sort of the kind of the way it's being done, right? And it's been a long time since I published the book where I talked about this, but I think in the book I talked about we should do this volitionally. The Americans should support this, and we should do it over an 8 or 10 year period where everybody knows what the milestones are. In 2 years, these forces will be gone. In 4 years, these other things will be gone. In 6 years, you guys will have to staff this much of the command structure. And then we would transition the North Atlantic Treaty into a more classical kind of an alliance. And then the military structure would largely be organized by the Europeans. I want to do that deliberately. Well, people would say to me, it's never going to happen deliberately. And I'd say, well, if it doesn't happen deliberately, my fear is it's going to happen another way. And now it is happening another way. So I'm not happy with the way it's working because, fast moves and sudden changes in international politics can, people see windows of opportunity, windows of vulnerability, and there's just room for a lot of mistakes. So I'm not happy with the method, but I think the direction is right, and it's even more right than it was when I made the argument 10 years ago, because America has continued its fiscal profligacy for the last 10 or 12 years, and there's no end in sight, right? So this idea that we're just gonna for all these projects that we take on in the world, we're just going to keep putting them on a credit card, and we're not going to suffer anything for it. It's strange it's strange credulity. Now, it could be true. I'm not an economist. It could be that we could borrow, twice as much as we've borrowed. I don't know, but most economists seem to feel not good about that. Right, as far as I can tell, they feel not good about it. Right, and the second thing is China's power has grown apace. So the challenge in the Pacific, if you're of that mindset, and many people are, looks larger than it was, right? So I would say, our need for this, for those allies that have the capacity to look after themselves, our need for them to look after themselves is even higher than when I made the argument 10 or 12 years ago. Right. So I'm good with the direction. Right. I am not so happy with the what I perceive to be the lack of any kind of well thought out middle range strategy to bring this about over a reasonable piece of time, which would have taken quite a lot of leadership. I was probably asking too much, but nevertheless, that would have been my ideal type way of doing this.
So really quick, and Eva, we're definitely going to give you a chance to weigh in. So I'm happy with the direction, but I think I have a question over the degree. And so kind of how far would you want this to go? I mean, I think we have to start also from the US perspective, be contemplating, thinking through the things that we lose. What will we no longer, well, Europe might start taking positions that are at odds with the United States. When we say we need to go into Afghanistan, we might not have allies who are willing to come along with us.
Or
Like,
not
so
host our
what are
base.
the costs that you're willing, or the things you're okay with
That I've
losing?
dealt with in the past. See, I don't want to go to Afghanistan, so I don't care if the Europeans don't want to go. And I don't particularly want to be involved in the Persian Gulf, so I don't care if they don't want to go. Right? I think the United States is inherently a pretty secure and pretty self-reliant country. Right? It takes really big things in the world, right, to affect our security, and I really only want to use military power for big things. Right? So, I'm comfortable with, you know losing the European bases for intervention in the Middle East or other places. I'm comfortable with that, and I'm comfortable with having Europe that stands up for itself and was willing to argue with us. This is a bad idea. I wish someone had argued more vehemently that the invasion of Iraq was a bad idea. It would have been a really good thing to have a whole lot of international pushback against that idea, right? So, in general, I'm just not. I'm not moved by those kinds of arguments, right? I'm just not.
So, plenty of pushback on Iraq. One of my colleagues here at Belfer Center is Nick Burns, and he still has the bruises on the pushback from the Allies. I guess this is where Barry and I just fundamentally disagree. Not in the directionality, because I think we're all of that, but I actually do believe that the United States is much better off to having strong allies and alliances. Not in order to continue to conduct a foreign policy that it's been conducting in the way it does, but the new foreign policy it needs to conduct. We are in an era of massive strategic competition with China, and we're losing it. We're losing it on the scientific area. We're losing it on the economic area, and frankly, we're losing it militarily. And there's one thing that we have that the Chinese will never have, and it's allies. And so the question of how you shift burdens among allies and who takes responsibility for what and how is a very legitimate question. And in fact, one that should have been on the table and be debated very, very much more. One of the reasons we haven't debated it, to be particularly blunt on it, is because those like Barry who argued that it shouldn't be a shifting of burdens, but a devolution, in which, in fact, the United States should be liberated from the responsibilities it had to work with its allies, except as in the most dire of dire circumstances, which, by the way, when you are a European and you lived through 38 and 39 and 40, when the United States wasn't there, or indeed 14, 15, 16, and 1917, before the United States became involved, is not a reassuring part of the way. I think it is incredibly important for America's security, for its prosperity, and ultimately for its freedom, that it has strong military, economic, political, democratic allies who work with the United States on common issues. and that NATO is a foundational, as Barack Obama used to say, a cornerstone of that effort, but it's not the only one. I have long argued, Andrea, you will remember, in the run up to the Biden to the 2020 campaign, that we should globalize the G7 to bring Asian, European, and North American allies in a strategic partnership that included military, economic, and political ways in order to deal effectively with China, with China's friendship with Russia in particular, Iran, North Korea a little less so, but still very importantly. So I think not only the way, but the directionality that we are going is one of the will be regarded by history as at least as significant, if not more significant, than the decision in the early 1920s to disengage from the world. The United States has responsibilities because we are a major power. It is better to exercise those responsibilities in concert with those who are like-minded to us. That's what NATO is about. That's what's new. That's why this 40 to 75, 80-year period of history is also the greatest period of great power peace that we've had. So on that, but that's a debate Barry and I and we've been having for a very long time on the larger issue of the relative balance. Things need to change, and I think Barry and I would completely agree. However, we want to do it, we want to do this in a cooperative and not in the kind of destructive way we have seen up to date.
Yeah, I think so. I think this is the debate that I think we need to have more of. It's like this has been reopened. It's up for relitigation. Where, again, we all agree on the direction, but it's the degree of how far we let this go. And I think we need a lot more, and I think I've said this on this podcast before, debate, discussion, and intentionality about where we let the pendulum fall. I mean, because, Ivo, if we give up SACEUR, if we devolve all of this power to Europe, then can we maintain the economic, the technological, and those types of close partnerships that I also agree make the United States better off? I don't know. I don't know. Barry, those are all things that you're I don't want to put it that way. Those are things that the costs of losing those kinds of close relationships aren't significant enough that you think that we need to maintain some of this interdependence.
I think, and in a weird way, I think we've agreed that what NATO became over the last 30 years was a carefully, cultivated system of dependence and subordination, right? Which, as the world changed, has become costlier and riskier for the United States to maintain, right? That relationship had to change and had to change fundamentally. There's, to my way of thinking, there is nothing about an entirely rewired transatlantic relationship that is inconsistent with future alliance behavior, future economic cooperation, or anything else. My view is that whatever of that we do now is built on a foundation of inequality and dependence, right? And hence, and I think that foundation of inequality and dependence is a rot that permeates the entire edifice. Right? I can't prove that, but I think that it is, right? So when people talk about economics and trade wants to happen between capitalist countries. Liberal capitalist countries want to trade with each other. On the eve of the First World War, Britain and Germany, believe it or not, were one another's largest trading partners, right? I don't see the trade issue as being very important if the security relationship changes fundamentally. I just don't see it as being significantly affected. I actually don't even see cooperation to address certain problems posed by China to be limited by a change in this relationship. I think it's enabled, right? I would like to see a stronger European Union. I would like to have a stronger ally in opposing the Chinese, right? So my view is, and again, at some point this sounds paternalistic no matter who says it, right? But I want the Europeans to stand up on their own 2 feet and create the potential to be an actual ally in the traditional sense. Now, I'm willing to take the downside of that, which is an ally that sticks up for itself and says no sometimes, right? And that doesn't just say no, but has the power to actually get in your way, right? And the reason I'm not worried about that is because I think we start from a very good base here, and I think what we would get in such a transformed relationship would exceed what it is we're going to lose.
That's a perfect place to end. This was a fantastic discussion. Barry, Ivo, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you all both. It was fabulous as Andrea and I were trying to put together both this and also our next podcast. We were hoping to have this kind of debate, and we certainly did. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Brussels Sprouts, brought to you by the Transatlantic Security Team at the Center for a New American Security. You can find all of our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts. And please remember to rate and review Brussels Sprouts so that new listeners are able to find the show.